Hey, welcome everyone and good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Reeves, the Global Engagement Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and I will be the moderator and host for today's discussion on closing the corporate accountability gap in pursuit of the Paris Agreement. There was a last-minute change to the programme and our planned moderator cannot make it, so I fill her shoes in her absence. So I'm very excited for today's discussion. We have a great lineup of speakers to discuss strengthening corporate accountability and to better understand each of our roles so that companies feel both included and obligated to meet the climate goals alongside governments. We will start with a keynote address and then followed by some scene setting to a white paper that WBA published in September, and then we will move on to the panel of fabulous speakers that we have here today. We want to cultivate an open discussion. So even though it's a panel, we'd like to think it's more a bit like a roundtable. So we welcome the audience to raise hands and ask questions. And we also encourage the speakers to build on each other and ask questions to each other. So to start, let me welcome Per Frederick Farrow, Director of NORAD's Climate Change Department, Government of Norway. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. The question I was supposed to answer is why is closing the corporate accountability gap in pursuit of the Paris Agreement important? And I suspect you all have a general idea of why that is. But I think it's quite simple. Accountability drives behavior, and we need behavior change, and we need it fast. Before going further on that, I would say that a lot has happened, obviously, and a number of corporates have taken incredible responsibility over the last few years. We're in a completely different situation than we were 15 years ago. But we also know that it's not enough. We also know that policy action, while increasing, is not enough. So there needs to be cooperation. And I like to think about it as an upward spiral. In other words, levels of ambition push each other either downwards or upwards. And traditionally, perhaps, it's been downwards. But what we really need to see is every sector, corporate, civil society, government, in particular finance, upping their ambition and thereby not only creating results themselves, but also opening up the space for higher ambitions in other sectors. And that, I think, is the crucial point. The Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative, which I was leading for a while, tried to grasp this by working along working with all the actors of the system to try to change it. So the key thing with deforestation is you need policy change, you need laws, regulations, and enforcement. But we all know that doesn't always exist, and it's politically very hard to put in place. However, if those companies that want the right thing and do the right thing, the traders, the consumer goods companies like Unilever, the traders like Wilmar and so on, change their behavior and get their interests aligned with regulation and start advocating for regulation, then that opens up the space for regulation and political action, and vice versa. So this is a crucial point. We need these actors to work together, and the corporate side is sorely needed in that space. So how does that happen? That, of course, is clearly a question of transparency, number one. Investing in transparency is crucial, and I think entities like World Benchmarking Alliance, but I would also mention SBTI, TNFD, TCFD, CDP, and so on, are essential to help drive this forward. But at the end of the day, real corporate accountability is, of course, put in place by regulation. And I think we're seeing that from the EU, we're seeing it from the US, we're seeing it from others, but we simply haven't gotten far enough. The last point I want to make is that when it comes to corporate accountability and the corporate accountability gap, one crucial point that to me at least serves as an acid test is lobbying behavior. Because we do have a situation where a large number of companies have taken on ambitious targets on climate, ambitious targets on nature. Some are actually complying, some are not necessarily complying, but their lobbying behavior is the essential point. Because a company that is serious about going sustainable, going green, going carbon neutral, going nature net positive, will also lobby for regulatory frameworks that promote that as a standard, because that will level the playing field for them vis-a-vis the competitors. Companies that are not serious about it will probably lobby for something else, will be part of organizations that lobby for something else. So accountability regarding lobbying behavior, I think, is crucial, and it's also one of the first things we should look at. I want to return briefly to what we do as NORAD to promote corporate accountability, because what we try to do is to get at it from various angles. So we work with countries. Of course, we work with our partners in the Global South to promote carbon-friendly, green regulatory regimes, but we also finance those entities that promote transparency. I mentioned some earlier, Global Forest Watch as well, pushing the envelope from a situation where there is opacity to one where there is transparency, where companies can be held to account by civil society, by consumers, and by governments. And we work with those companies that want to drive green incomes, including by off-taking risks, where green investments are more expensive or have a risk-return profile that is not acceptable, but where the investment is still necessary. All of these approaches are helpful, but at the end of the day, corporate accountability will only happen if there is regulatory reform and enforcement. I think to close off, that is something we have seen in the area of deforestation, for example, where deforestation trends are essentially directly tied to regulatory regime and political will to enforce. It's those two things. You can work as a corporate on deforestation-free supply chains. You can, as an investor, be transparent about trying to drive it. But the problem is there's always going to be bad money. There's always going to be someone making money out of a lack of regulatory regimes. So at the end of the day, that's what solves the problem. But the point from my side, and I hope the key point in this discussion, is that by increasing action on every front, the political space to really implement business accountability through regulatory and enforcement action opens up, and that will see the speeding up that we need to have if we're going to stand any chance to make 1.5 degrees. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Per. Really appreciate it and agree. Very critical to have transparency and also the critical role of regulation, but without the different roles of actors within the ecosystem, including working with the companies themselves, there would be no path forward. So thank you very much for those words. Just before we speak to our panel, I'd like to invite Gerben Haverkamp, who is the Executive Director of the World Benchmarking Alliance. If we just turn to the second slide on the screen, actually, I have that. There we go. He'll talk us through actually what we mean by the corporate accountability process. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Per, and thank you, panelists, for being here. So my name is Gerard Haverkamp. I'm the Executive Director of the World Benchmark Alliance, and I want to say a few words about how we started, because it informs partly why we're arrived here today. So the World Benchmark Alliance was launched in 2018 during the UN General Assembly, and we were set out with the mission to assess the world's 2,000 most influential companies and what they're contributing to the SDGs. And at that time, there was quite a lot of optimism around the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and there was a lot of talk that you could summarize along the lines of the private sector has a huge role to play, and we just need to incentivize the private sector to then play that role, and then all will be fine. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but that was a bit of the mood. What we are now seeing, if we now look at 5 years of benchmarking, we see that that language around role and incentivizing no longer cuts it. We need to work towards language that is much more framed around responsibility and accountability. Because it's just a myth that, yesterday I use the word myth because yesterday there was Chris Hone, the investor, he said it's a myth that companies are going to decarbonize on a voluntary basis. They just can't do it. We need to set the accountability framework right for them. And what we are trying to understand as the World Benchmark Alliance then is, of course, so yes, benchmarks play a part in it, but on their own they do nothing. So we need to place them in a much wider system. So that's what we're trying to do with corporate accountability, and I don't want to go into sort of all the details, but just to give you a bit of framing that also explains why these different panelists we think are relevant to the sectors that they represent are relevant to this process of strengthening corporate accountability. First of all, any form of corporate accountability, in our view, needs to start with the global agendas. We are here today to talk, and this week, about the Paris Agreement, but it also includes our global biodiversity framework, the SDGs, human rights. If that is not the starting point for corporate accountability, then we're missing the actual point. Those global agendas inform a lot of societal expectations, but in a very wide-ranging and different views. They vary across sectors, they vary across the globe, and this puts a problem for companies because it's unclear to them on which expectations they need to deliver. It is also then, of course, unclear about what expectations they can be held accountable. So we believe there's a large role for the UN to, in these global agendas, be much more articulated about not only what role there is for the private sector, but also what their responsibility is, very much along the lines of how we've seen that in human rights. Per, you mentioned a couple of other very important organizations that I would put under standards and frameworks. Those are the organizations like TNFD, TCFD, there's now a task force on social happening. They, in effect, translate and create the frameworks that business needs to then measure and report what is happening. That allows organizations like us to then assess and see how companies perform against each other, how they perform over time, and ultimately, how does their performance stack up in terms of what needs to happen in the context of the global agendas. And even that, if we would get that right, we would be far, but it's still not enough. Because it will only help companies change if their performance and their impact becomes consequential to their success. And I think this is where what Per alluded to, there are a couple of actors in our society that have the power to make the impact of companies consequential to their success. Investors is one of them. Civil society in its broader sense in terms of reputation, consumer is another one. And then the third, which is massively important, is regulatory action. And these are the three forces in society that can make the impact of companies consequential to their success. And if we do that, it allows companies to transform. If we don't do that, then the leaders don't get the reward and the laggards don't get the penalty. And then for companies, the economics simply don't add up to go and prolong that transition. So that's a little bit of the framing. I hope with that I've shared that as the World Benchmark Alliance, we play a little part in that by doing the ranking and the assessments, but we can only do that work in the context of the global agendas through the work done by these standards and frameworks, and it's only effective if investors, regulators, and other societal actors take the action forward and help companies in this transformation by making it consequential. So I'm really looking forward to the perspective of this panel, and I'll hand it now over in the capable hands of Charlotte Reeves. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Herbrand. Even though you're back in the audience, I hope that you participate in the conversation that we have alongside other audience members. So now to introduce the panel, I'll start on the far left-hand side of the stage. So this is Dr. Cindy Zamora-Byrne, the director of the Southern Africa Embrace Foundation. Then we have Laurent Compere, managing director and head of stewardship and engagement from Boston Commons Asset Management. We also have Daniela, senior vice president and global head, public affairs, science and sustainability of consumer health at Bayer. Then we have Bertrand Millet, chief sustainability officer at CDPQ. And we also have Fernando Castellanos, head of environment and climate at UN Global Compact. So as you can see, we have a diverse group of stakeholders in the room today, so hoping for a very fruitful discussion. So I'd like to start by posing a couple of questions to what we call the SDG 2000 company representatives. So the SDG 2000 are essentially the 2,000 global companies that WBA has identified as critical for transforming systems and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and other agendas like Paris Agreement. So starting with Daniela from Bayer, my first question to you is, where do you get the clarity of your business responsibility from? And how does this responsibility drive your company culture? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here. Good afternoon. I sort of feel like an uninvited guest to like a party that's happening, going on over there. So thank you all for bearing with us. I guess a couple of reflections on this. So I reflect a little bit on why I joined Bayer. I joined the business in 2019. And one of the reasons I joined is because I wanted to work with a company that was working on what I would call essential needs. So healthcare on one hand, and then food and agriculture on another. And I remember when I was considering joining the company, I said, okay, I get you want to go on a sustainability journey, you want to reboot everything you've done before, that's great. But the question I had is, do you really mean it? And how core is this to your business, and how core is this to the models and where you want to go? And one of the things I was impressed with as I was meeting with members of the board is they said, yep, this is how we need to think about the future of our business and future-proofing it. It's going to be core to what we want to do. And then if I fast forward a year after being there, we rebooted our mission with a clear mission and vision of health for all, hunger for none, and launched a new set of sustainability targets covering the environmental side and the social side. At that time, what was interesting is we started with incentives. So 20% of our board of management's remuneration was based on achieving our sustainability goals. That was novel back then. We were one of the first large industrial companies to do that. Now over a third of publicly traded companies have that at their core. So I think mission and really embedding this into your business is critical. We made a point to say that we're not going to have a separate sustainability strategy that's off on the side and that's a peripheral thing. It's actually core and embedded into our business. So it's in our quarterly business reviews. It's in what we talk about with our board. We also have an external sustainability council that pressure tests us on a number of different things and holds us accountable. So I think this mix of the sort of three core things I would say. One is really embedding this into your business so that it's core. I think that's critical. Two is having the right incentives around it. And then three, which we can talk about later, is I do think it's key to focus on what's most material and then the transparency of that externally.
Thank you, Daniela. And I think that question, do you mean it and how core is it to your business, is a good question that we can ask many of the corporate commitments that we see during COP. So thank you very much. I'll now move to Bertrand Millet, who's from CDPQ, and we actually assess CDPQ in our finance system benchmark, where we look at 400 financial institutions across the world. So, Bertrand, how do you understand what the expectations are for your own investment teams? And how do you reflect on the change needed in the culture of your investment teams across CDPQ?
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. Just a little context on CDPQ. We are a pension fund asset owner, 420 billion Canadian dollars. We manage 6 asset classes, 85% internally, and 60% of our assets are private. Those factors are quite important to understand how we push sustainability. We started our climate journey the day after the Paris Agreement, literally in January 2016, where we thought, okay, this is really important and we need to do something about it. By the fall of 2017, we announced a climate policy, one of the very first by a large institutional investor. We then went on to found the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance in 2019. Our policy today is that we are expected to triple our green assets by 2025 to $54 billion, to reduce the carbon footprint of the portfolio, intensity of the portfolio by 25% by 2025 and 60% by 2030. And we have also announced a $10 billion envelope to invest in brown to green. We have also a number of exclusion. And an important thing is that we use external taxonomies, the CBI taxonomy, to define what is green. This is important, and transition. And this is important because it's an external benchmark. So we want clarity. It's not up for negotiations, and our investment teams are experts at negotiation. It's not me who decides. It's my friend Sean Kidney at CBI, and therefore the complaints department is not here. It's a key management tool to make sure everybody's on the same wavelength. So those targets that I just mentioned are then cut into targets for the individual investment teams, which reflect their business model. Obviously, investing in green for listed equities is more difficult than in the infrastructure space, for example, or in real estate. And so we take that on board, and we set targets which are ambitious but realistic for the investment teams. And very important, and I was pleased to hear your point also on that, is we have linked variable compensation to achieving this target for everybody at CDPQ. Not just the CEO, not just the investment teams, everybody. And so that means that the message is very clear. Climate is important. Everybody understands what we're trying to do and where we're going. And the support teams, whether it's IT, HR, financial governance, or the public affairs, everybody's on board when we need assistance to actually push the agenda internally. And this is very, very important generally. I mean, we're doing it, but we expect portfolio companies to do this. Climate is not about sending somebody up a chimney to measure emissions. It's about thinking holistically about the whole business as to how it's going to transform and make sure all the bits and pieces of the business that operate this thing actually take advantage of the opportunities that the transition affords. Our policy is public. Obviously, and so it makes it very clear to companies in portfolio where we come from. And, you know, very importantly, we apply it to ourselves. So it's easy for us to then say, okay, what about you guys? What are you up to? We use, and so tools that we use to interact with portfolio companies is that we engage with the public ones through investors relations, but also at the board level, very senior level, and we have a graduated approach to engage, see what happens, and then if nothing happens too fast, we may actually vote on, say, on climate proposals to ask them to submit their climate plans to their shareholders, and if things don't happen, we might vote against members of the board. And that's actually personalizing things a little bit, but it's a very effective tool. When you look at somebody on the board and say, we're going to vote you off the board, then it becomes personal and they don't like it. And often we see movement, whether it's on climate or whether it's on the questions of diversity and inclusion at the board. That is a very effective tool. We need to be realistic, though. We can't set the bar too high. Companies operate in a certain competitive environment, in a certain regulatory environment. They need to be ambitious, but it needs to remain realistic, otherwise they won't talk to us. So if we want to have ambition, we need to remain somewhat realistic. We expect companies to divulge. It's very important. TCFD, detailed targets, transition plans. We'll be asking for ISSB soon. We're certainly going to start divulging on the ISSB over the next 2 years. We're going to do that. Important to show the way again. On private assets, which we have a lot in the portfolio, as I mentioned, we have people on board. We engage with management. In the infrastructure, our infrastructure investments, we've recently mandated to all companies in portfolio that they produce DCFD reports. That's typically not done by private companies, but in this case, we just told them, do it. On climate risk, physical risk, because it's very important for adaptation, what we also have done is made it the company's problem. We identify the issue with tools that we have at our disposal, and then we bring the report to the CEO's desk and say, okay, what are you going to do about this? And often they didn't even know they had a problem, but it's their responsibility to actually do it. So you see accountability here, whether it's internally or externally, it's very, very important. And I think, by far and large, corporate reporting is still insufficient, so we're pushing. But we're pushing for changes of the corporate culture, the same way we've done it to ourselves. Tone at the top, linked to compensation, clear and ambitious goals, but that remain achievable, and see progress over time. The TCFD is, people say, well, the TCFD, it's really hard it's a really hard thing to produce. No, sorry, it's a guide to a story. Just, make the story, then it's easy to tell. But if you have nothing to say, yes, it's difficult to read, to write. So that's basically our.
Thank you very much, Breton. It's very interesting to hear about the need for external benchmarks. Like you said, that you need clarity, and this clarity should not be up for negotiation. And how you went into how you're driving this internally in your own company culture, and then obviously using the tools when you talk to portfolio companies to push for corporate change in their culture too. So thank you very much. Shifting gears a little bit now, I'm going to ask a question to Cindy. So we've obviously heard from a corporate side, and I want to focus more on the role of civil society. So at COP, obviously, it's all about the global agendas. It's all very high level. So to what extent are global agendas, like the Paris Agreement, local agendas also? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you so much for having us here together. And for the invitation to be part of the panel, speaking from a civil society standpoint. Most of the work that I do is around the African continent. So in this aspect, probably I'll be sharing from that context. I mean, if we look at the Paris Agreement itself, it's 7 years old. And we found that as NGOs, particularly for those of us who are grassroots, and we work primarily in the rural areas that are heavily marginalized, we are lacking in follow-ups or just the understanding of the agreement itself. We know from a policy level what the agreement says. It talks about adaptation, it talks about P3s, it talks about communication, infrastructure, funding, accountability, and so forth. But what we are finding as organizations working within different communities and having to deal with the most marginalized communities, particularly now with climate change is that even in the sense of trying to address the global agenda on a local level, we found there isn't that much of information that has been made available from the global stage, because the one-size-fits-all model does not work, especially in the African context, because what can work in Canada and how things are adapted to in Canada can certainly not work in a country like Malawi, where people survive on 20 cents a day. Where on the Canadian context, there's infrastructure, there's information, there's data, there are resources, there are so many things that are put in place for people to be able to follow up, for the government to be able to work with civil society, to share on climate change. There's education, which is also something that's within the agreement. On the African context, there isn't even much education on it. And so we come across constraints of how do we now educate people about this global agenda, bring them to the forefront, bring them to the tables of policy decision-making tables, but also so that for them, they're not left behind. But if they're not educated about the agreement, they don't understand how it's stripped from paper to their day-to-day understanding and living circumstances, it's very difficult. We've even gone into different regions within the continent. So we mainly work in the Southern African region, but we've now gone into West Africa to see how the translation from a global stage fits into regional and then national levels. So we found there's a big gap in how each government reports on the work that they're doing on climate change, the information that they're sending out to the communities on the effects of climate change, whether it's food security, it's health, mitigation, capacity building, and so forth. And so we often find that now our work is chasing after the resources where we now need funding, and funding is a very big issue for us. Because not everybody has the money or would want to invest in climate change, because there are so many other things that are going on around the world. So I think what needs to happen in the African context is that I think there has to be a big strategy within leaders, hopefully, that are here at COP28, in how they can come up with regional reporting structures that can be adapted to say, as SADC region, as East Africa, West Africa, this is how we're going to follow up on what's been done by each of the countries. Particular emphasis on how do we gather that information, how do we put infrastructure in place, how do we ensure that there is communication that moves from one government department to the other. Not only that, what are the stakeholders that we need to be working with? Emphasize the P3s, and then put action. When we talk about investments, let's not come to COP or any other gatherings and talk about we're going to put money on the table to do this, but then we go back to our countries and that is not done. So what we are now doing as NGOs, particularly in my organization, we've now went out and said we're implementing our own fund where we're trying to go out to angel investors and to say, this is the work that we're doing. We're currently working with over 27,000 farmers, mostly women and youth within the rural communities across the southern region of Southern Africa. And what we're doing is we want the fund to be able to address the very issues of climate change. We're going to put it towards infrastructure. We're going to put it towards capacity building. We're going to put it towards educating the farmers about climate change. We're also looking at greenhouse farming. We're looking at blue carbon. So there's so many things that we'd like to do. But even for us to be able to do that, we don't only want to look at it from a national or regional level. We want it to be global. Because what affects those communities, whether it's in Malawi or in Zambia, also affects everyone around the world. So in just a nutshell, I think what needs to happen is really the corporate accountability. There has to be a concrete, whether they have to build regional bodies that will be able to follow up on what each country is doing, what each specific government has done. Where it's lacking, invest in education, educate the community about climate change, and then also invest in how can we adapt as the climate keeps changing. How do we adapt to ensure that there's zero emissions? We talk about carbon, we talk about reducing the temperatures, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, the big thing is food security. What can be done to ensure that we also adapt to putting funds toward ensuring that we address that SDG goal, SDG number 2 for food security. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, very important, I think, when you're saying that understanding from a policy level up is there, but there's that big gap of understanding on a community level and how to really bring that to policymakers. I think you brought some really good examples, because only through that way, through mobilizing different groups, can the voices of those that traditionally have the most limited influence actually move through the supply chain and actually get to the corporate headquarters through those different avenues. So thank you very much for those reflections. Okay, I'm going to move to Fernando Castellanos from the UN Global Compact, so slightly back to a global level, international level. And yeah, Fernando, what is the role of UN Global Compact in strengthening corporate accountability?
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks very much for WBA for the invitation to be here. So the UN Global Compact, for those that don't know, it's a corporate sustainability initiative of the UN Secretary General. It has been around for a little over 20 years. We now have about 18,000 companies in our membership. We call them participants, but they're essentially members, and a little over 3,000 business-related organizations also within our membership. And what the Global Compact aims to do is mobilize the private sector along a principle-based approach. So we cover 10 principles on human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. So within our anti-corruption work, we also look at governance, and that's where accountability becomes a crucial part. And so we aim at mobilizing companies, and a few years ago, we, together with other organizations, started the SBTI and pushing companies to set science-based targets. But we know this is not enough. One thing is to have a company set a target to work on its emissions, but we also want to encourage these companies to really put their money where their mouth is. So one of the things we do, we have a CFO coalition, and throughout the past year with the CFOs in this coalition, we've been looking at, where are they investing where are these companies making their investments? And this is not banking institutions, but companies, let's say, more in the real economy, cement companies, steel companies. So we're working with them to see, are they putting the money that would go towards achieving the targets that they've set? Are they doing or working towards what they said they intend to do? So this is part of, I think it's crucial to assess that. It's kind of like follow the money to find like certain answers. And so this is the beginning of our work that is focused on the financial aspect. But we also recognize that a lot of companies, whether big multinationals or SMEs, don't necessarily know how to work on the accountability aspect. They also need capacity building. Companies from beginning to the end are encompassed by people. There's turnovers, there's systems in place, but they don't always translate into a new person learning, knowing how to use that system. They need within the company to have that capacity building, but also they need to be updated on the developments that happen, the recommendations, for instance, by the Task Force on Nature Financial Related Disclosures, or the TNFD, TCFD, all of these different frameworks. And so we work with the different entities also to communicate to our membership. We have different tools at our disposal, and we aim to communicate in the best possible ways, bringing the experts to the companies and ensure that there's that engagement. And we are constantly working with a set of local networks which are not the typical UN country offices. Our local networks are in 69 countries, both developed and developing. And with them, we encourage to have peer learning groups, also have discussion among the companies, those that are making significant progress, can they share their experiences with other companies, whether it's, again, big multinationals or SMEs, and have that exchange among experts, among practitioners in the companies in different areas. And we sort of make sure that we try to be, we don't make sure, but we try to be sort of an interface between what's going on in the UN arena and the business world. And so we try to translate these sort of mechanisms and outcomes from the negotiations towards businesses, so they can have a little bit of an understanding, knowing that it's complex and knowing that this needs to be translated, all of the outcomes from international processes such as these, they need to be translated at the national level to have regulation that would allow for accountability of companies. So we try to support the capacity building in that for their compliance.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So again, about that gap or that lack of clarity and understanding capacity even inside companies themselves, and for you and Global Compact to really try and be that interface between the agendas to translate them into business expectations. So thank you, Fernando, for that contribution. Move to Lauren now. Obviously, as this is a diverse panel of stakeholders, we're jumping around themes a little bit. So, I hope that's okay. But Lauren, you're part of, you work for the Boston's Common Asset Management. And I want to ask you, how would bringing clarity to business responsibility in pursuit of the Paris Agreement help your work as an investor and the norms and standards with which you could ask companies to comply with?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think so.
You're able to hear me? Okay. I can't even hear myself. So I'm from the U.S., and I think many of you here probably recognize that the U.S. is a very different market where I might actually be engaging with a company that doesn't even believe in climate, and which is supported by many of the states. So there's different kinds of investors. So we're a sustainable investor. We invest globally. We're a B Corp. We don't invest in fossil fuels. So we're kind of like one of those companies that obviously believe in the need to address climate, and also to hold ourselves accountable. So similar to my colleague on the panel, we're members of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. We've set our own targets relative to our own portfolio emissions. We use all our stewardship tools, whether it's engaging on public policy. I've been fighting the good fight with the SEC, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, for years now to get, mandatory disclosure of climate at some level. I hope we're close. Something was supposed to come out in October. We also, though, engage and support global norms and also the need for global agendas. For example, in the EU, there's the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Disclosure. But what was interesting is the financial sector wasn't included in that, and so we're actually part of a group of investors supporting that. What would the Paris Agreement sort of getting more formalized into global agendas, setting sort of higher level expectations? Right now, I'm actually engaging companies globally on TCFD disclosure, setting, even qualifying and publicly asking them to set net zero by 2050, robust interim targets. It's a lot easier to do that in the EU versus the US and maybe some emerging markets. So if there's sort of this understanding of like what the global framework what the global standards are, it's a lot easier than to go in to a company and go, okay, you have the pathway, you know what the framework is asking you to do. versus, negotiating, this is why we're different, this is why we have to only set carbon intensity targets versus absolute GHG emissions. So similar to the UNGPs, it changes the narrative and it changes the conversation. It accelerates the conversation. And then it makes it a lot easier to then work on the other things like, supporting the standards, supporting the right data that's needed. Because right now, as investors, we're relying a lot on estimated data. And I would love just a global framework that says disclosure of real GHG emissions, not just Scope 1, Scope 2, but also Scope 3. Yeah. And I think having transparency, and then I did want to address one comment on accountability. It also sort of supports the premise of real accountability, not just with companies, but then enabling stakeholders to come in, civil society, impacted communities, indigenous peoples, to have a higher level leverage and influence when corporate accountability is linked to a global framework or a global norm.
Thank you, Lauren. And actually, a follow-up question, because you mentioned the UN guiding principles on human rights, and obviously Gabran mentioned that in the introduction as an example where business responsibility has been articulated on that global level. And I just wondered if you could delve a little bit more into some of the learnings that we can take from the UNGPs. I know that you work quite actively alongside the John Ruggie process, so we'd love to hear more about that and what we can learn on a climate side of things.
Absolutely. It really, when the UN Human Rights Council endorsed the UNGPs in 2011, it really set sort of that global framework of expectations and moved the conversation. So previously we would engage a company on human rights and they would say, well, here's how we're advancing human rights. Here's how we're protecting human rights. No. It's about respecting human rights, and it's embedding that responsibility within the corporation. And the same thing, it raises the level of accountability. You need to assess real and perceived, right? You need to mitigate, and you need to address adverse impacts. And then it also opens up the ability for, again, stakeholders, impacted communities, to seek remedy. And that's what we need in the world of climate right now.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. Okay, Daniela, I'm going to move back to you for a second. Just to ask, after hearing from investors, from UN Global Compact, and from the perspective of civil society on their role in driving accountability, I wonder, how does Bayer feel their accountability? So how is accountability driving business practice for Bayer in pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals? How do you feel it? Is it coming from investors, civil society? Do you have much insight from a company level on that?
The push and the pull, right?
Yeah.
So maybe a couple of perspectives on this. If you would have asked me a decade ago, when would we have that next level push of accountability around sustainability, I would have said when investors start to care. That was always it. When investors start to care and we see the flow of funds, we saw a lot of that in the midst of the pandemic. We saw it rise and then we saw it drop, which on one hand was, yes, we've had a peak for sustainability, but then we also had the trough. So in terms of this moving forward, I think you need a confluence of factors. It is what people were talking about. I think for companies, you need to see some push from investors, absolutely. But sometimes investors don't get there as quickly as you would like them to. These two colleagues are quite enlightened. That's not all investors. So I do think continuing to push on the investor front is critical. I also think being responsible and responsive to who you serve. So in our case, to the point on like stakeholders and communities, that matters. We're in over 100 low and middle income countries. We do a lot of work around accessibility. We work a lot with farmers, smallholder farmers, the majority of whom are women. And so we end up getting pretty close to the issues that they face, and they bring that back. And so we're now having conversations, for example, around our portfolio, where we've actually undertaken research to start to design with those needs in mind of people who maybe 10 years ago we might not have served. And so it's informing our strategic choices. So I do think that your stakeholders in the community are important. I also think frameworks are important as well. They're not everything, and we do have quite a lot, at least from a reporting perspective. But I would really urge harmonization of those, so that we have that harmonization and standardization and can kind of raise the bar across the board. So I do think a confluence of all of those are really important. And then the last one that I don't want to forget, because I think it's also really important from a company side, is your employees. So our employees really, really care about sustainability. And when I think about talent, they're making decisions on where they want to work and where they want to stay based on the values and purpose and vision of the company and what they're doing on sustainability. So we also have internal sustainability champions who give us a healthy pressure test as well. And I think that's another important segment.
Thank you, Daniela. Really nice to hear those different push factors. And on that note, I'm going to turn to Bertrand and ask, obviously Daniela said that initially it was really about when the investors or the financial institutions started to care. And I wondered for CDPQ, where does that push come from? So kind of in context of a mandate that you have to your fiduciary duty to pension funds, but also perhaps if you could touch on CDPQ's dual mandate to also support the development of the Quebecan government and your relation to having that role.
Thank you. The Quebec population cares about sustainability generally. Quebec is quite a green province, and therefore our beneficiaries, the 8 million Quebecers, are very much in favor of what we try to do. Now, that said, it's, and you mentioned the word fiduciary responsibility, it's returns first and foremost. So we're not in any way, shape or form subjugating returns to sustainability, but the two go together. We are a very long-term investor with 25 to 50-year liabilities, and therefore we see investing in companies that are aligned towards the future, whether we're talking climate transition, that are geared to attract, and you just mentioned it, attract talent, and are positioned well compared to their competitors, to us is absolutely aligned with returns going forward. And this is what we need to be doing. With regards to our dual mandate, CDPQ does have the mandate to contribute to the economic development of Quebec. We do that in the same way that we invest abroad. We obviously take into account the fact that in Quebec there's some smaller companies. So in this case, we do things in Quebec that we wouldn't do elsewhere because we're just very, very big. But otherwise, you know, we invest in renewables in Quebec, we invest in industrial companies, we invest in real estate, we invest in everything that we do. It's part of the mandate, and it's something that's very important. And actually, we push Quebec companies also to be more accountable, to report. And you know, a very important aspect which we hear often from Quebec companies is like, well, I don't know if you guys know, but electricity in Quebec is 100% hydro. So they say, well, I have no emissions. So I say, please report that you don't have any emissions, because that's a competitive advantage in your supply chain. And so that's the type of message that we're trying to push. Not having any doesn't mean you don't need to report. Report zero and have it audited.
Yeah, Thank you very much. That links to the original remarks of transparency is key. It's key in order to really enable this corporate accountability process. So thank you. Probably my final question, which isn't going to be directed at anyone specifically, but I would like to hear a little bit more. Lauren, you started to touch on collective engagement, and so did you, Cindy. So perhaps we could, if anyone would like to reflect on how they're working with other stakeholders and how key that is for their work going forward. And then I'd also like to turn to the audience, and if anyone has a question or a comment or a reflection, then please raise your hand and we'll bring you into the conversation. Yes.
I'll say, with regards to the ecosystem, we take that very seriously. Yes, we are enlightened here, but we're pushing the rest of our peers, asset managers. We do a lot of engagement with asset managers to make sure they enlighten themselves because it's very important. And we're part of a lot of collaborative initiatives. Because even us, with our big portfolio, are still a very small voice, and we're, in public companies, a small shareholder. And when messages need to be put to companies, it is better if it's a collective message that's aligned, and where you have 10, 15, 20% of the shareholders who say the same thing. And management has to listen. Where if it's a shareholder which is 0.01%, obviously they don't necessarily listen as much.
Thank you. And just 1 second, because when you said around the relationship between asset owners and asset managers, something actually WBA will be working on in the next year with our financial system benchmark. And that, I think, goes quite nicely over to Lauren, because you've been involved in WBA collective engagements, but also obviously a lot more. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you.
I think it's really important to bring together different voices, and we are part of one of the collective impact coalitions at the WBA, working on ethical AI, but we're also part of a lot of collective initiatives focused on nature. For example, we're part of a group that formed the Finance Sector Deforestation Action, which brings together, it's a project of the UN High Global Champion, the Climate Champions, where we've formed together, informed by stakeholder input, a set of investor expectations for companies on deforestation. Having these different investor coalitions informed by stakeholder engagement, informed by experts, is I think, really important, because I think the ask then of companies is much more nuanced, and that's the WBA model.
Thank you. So now I'm going to hand it, well, is there anyone else that would like to build on that question of collective engagements?
I will. I think at the end of the day, if we're talking about especially climate, there's no one organization on their own that's going to solve climate. So you cannot fundamentally tackle climate without partnership. So partnership is a core part of almost everything we do at this point. I mean, we're involved in a number of different coalitions, from the LEAF Coalition on through to a number of things that we'll be launching here, on through to a lot of work that we do with smallholder farmers, and we have a Better Life Farming Center initiative that's actually a public-private partnership. So with IFC, us, and NetAffirm, so you have a whole kind of 360 on different sectors. These kinds of things, I think, increasingly are going to be the future. We also work across our entire industry, whether we're looking at things like regenerative agriculture, or on the health side, we have an effort called the Nutrient Gap Initiative, and it's expanding access to micronutrients for 50 million by 2030. That's we do that really closely in partnership with a number of NGOs and civil society, as well as kind of place-based health workers. So a lot of the key issues that we're talking about here, you can't do without doing that in partnership.
Agree. Thank you. And Cindy, I saw you raise your hand.
Sure. I think I just wanted to echo what everyone has said in the panel, but also I kept looking at the goals there, and I got stuck on people, stakeholders, and regulatory action. I think within civil society, that's exactly what we're trying to do, because we realize that the people that we serve and we advocate for don't necessarily have the capacity to enter these rooms. So we are the ones who come into these rooms on their behalf, and we are now going out and running NGOs in the development sector as if it's private entities, where we sit in the boardrooms, we come up with ideas, we exchange dialogue, and we're constantly knocking on those doors, trying to build those relationships, whether it's with any sector, whether it's pharmaceutical or manufacturing, UN entities at the African Union, to ensure that every stakeholder is involved, because realize, as you say, somebody said that you cannot do it alone. It's very important that we all work with different stakeholders, because then we're able to find ways as well as in how can we deal with some of these issues where, as just the development sector, we cannot handle them by ourselves. So we are also, particularly myself, I've invested in ensuring that I register myself in different networking groups, register the organization as well, where we get training, we learn, we network, we go out, and we even involve our communities on the ground with other stakeholders as well, whether it's within their communities, in the banks, in every sector, so that they have information, because information is what drives everything to be able to be done. Without information, we can't do anything.
Yeah, so being that information translator from civil society, from people, and then continually trying to push for a seat at the table. I wondered if, do you find there's been kind of a change over time in relation to other stakeholders being open and actually creating those mechanisms to involve civil society?
Oh, absolutely. I think in the Western world, it's been a little bit easier in the sense of translating, navigating those spaces. But within the African continent, it's a little bit hard, because they've always looked at the charity space as it's aid, and it's just aid on its own. And so now when you're trying to bring about a different model of, we're not changing the wheel, we're just trying to reinvent it and say, let's work in partnerships. I might come in as an NGO and I'm supposed to be neo-political, but it doesn't mean that I cannot work with the government to ensure that we're working hand in hand to do work to prosper the community. Yeah. But we're getting somewhere.
Okay, good to hear. That ends a little bit more on an optimistic note. I'd like to turn to the audience now and wondered if anyone had any reflections or questions for the panel. Yes, over there. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to share. I think that's speak. Thank you very much to share your perspectives and own experience. I'm Mikako Awano from Japan, but I have been TNFD task force alternate member, because TNFD team has that kind of alternate member scheme. So I'm deeply engaged in the development of the TNFD itself. And as you all of you know, one topic, big topic for TNFD is single materiality or double materiality. And thinking of corporate accountability, probably the question can be answered by WBA, because I have a discussion with a financial service agency of Japanese government, and because I know him very personally, and also have one professor I know very well also had the same kind of opinion about accountability itself, because accountability, it's all about to who corporate should be accountable. And in Europe, it's to the society, but in the US and in Japan, it's to shareholder only. It's not to the society. So that comes to the difference of the regulation. But thinking of it, the gap of the corporate, the gap of the corporate accountability does relate to the perspectives or difference of the perspective to who corporate should be accountable. And do you think that this, from my perspective, that absurd discussion, whether single or double, does affect that gap? In what way? And how do you think we can overcome that little bit absurd discussion? Because, at the end of the day, there's no single or double. That is all material. So, but still, we well, on jurisdictional level, they talk about single or double. So how do you think of this aspect about corporate accountability gap?
I'm sure there's some views in the panels. I'm just going to start, and then maybe other people in the panel want to chip in. So from WBA perspective, I'm going to say, for us, the difference between single and double materiality, we understand it, but the only thing relevant to WBA is double materiality. And that is because we benchmark it to the global agendas. So for us, the only thing that matters is the impact that companies have on the world. For investors, we understand the rational decisions that they need to take to distinguish between the two, what is financial material to the company and what to society. But when we benchmark a company and when we talk about corporate accountability, it is only about double materiality. I think the question that you asked, so in this white paper, we basically start with the question, who does a company feel accountable to and on what? And this difference, extremely per jurisdiction, basically by the differentiation that you mean, is it to society at large, is it to shareholders in a narrow form? It differs per industry, it differs for the size of companies, it depends on the ownership structure. We could have a fascinating conversation here in Dubai about where the oil and gas company feels accountable to and to whom, and etc. Right? So there are huge differences in how companies answer that question, and therefore there are huge differences to the influence that different stakeholders have over these companies. So I think it's a valid point, but I just want to clarify that for WBA, it is all about double materiality. It's not disregarding the importance of differentiating between the two, but from a societal point of view, it can only be about double materiality.
Thank you, Herbrand, and also for accommodating the front row because I miscalculated the seats. But before we go to Lauren, I just saw a hand with Per. We're going to go there first. You sure? Oh, no, yeah, you sure? Okay.
Oh, you have a mic.
Oh.
So I think we need to get away from even focusing on single or double. It's about risk to business, impact to people on planet. So it's about looking at the ecosystem of impacts. And again, that idea of accountable to whom and what. And let's put planet in that as well. I think I'm hoping that, I'm hoping that with now the ISSB, S1, S2 becoming sort of globally relevant, that we're going to move away from this single and double materiality. And the fact of the matter is we have to look at enterprise level risk and impact, both as investors and as companies. And I hate this, it's talking about single and double just doesn't get you anywhere. We need to change the narrative on what materiality is. And we are definitely not talking about just financial materiality.
And we've gone from single to double microphone use. So.
I know. I had to get a hold on this because I can actually hear myself now. So a couple of points. I mean, one of the things you mentioned in there is how does it differ, right, depending on where you are. And I do think that there is a difference. And I'll just say a couple of things. So, with Bayer, we're a German-based company. So we're knee-deep into double materiality. We will be doing that. That's just part of the journey that we're on. And I also hear you that we have to move away from so many different frameworks, everything. And at the end of the day, we really need to just get to impact and investing in impact. I hear that as well. Perhaps one reflection, because when I joined Bayer, one of the things that I found interesting is we would raise our hand to talk about stakeholder capitalism. Again, European company, it's different. I've worked in non-European companies. I've worked in US companies. You would not hear US companies talking about that. So I do think that it is different regionally, and there are different associations and connotations that come with this.
Thank you. I agree, it's different. And US and Canada are also different because we were more following a European model. But the good news is there are increasing standards, that was mentioned. Public opinion, social networks are forcing companies to take these things into account. Brave would be a board to say, well, I can disregard the opinion of my clients. And so that is forcing the considerations of the double materiality things because clients increasingly care. So that's a good thing.
Oh, yeah, and Fernando as well. you have your hand?
I just had another question. I had my time. So.
Oh, no, you can go.
Okay. Thanks. So, thanks first to the panelists for being more coherent than the keynote. I have sort of three issues that I think are quite crucial here, and I'd like to hear your responses. So number one is lobbying behavior, which I mentioned. Number two is if this is the question, is a company serious or not? What do we judge it by? So lobbying behavior. Scope 3 is serious action being taken to change Scope 3, meaning how do you relate to your suppliers, basically. And the third is CapEx. You can have a 2030 goal, but if your CapEx is off, it's not credible, and you're essentially just postponing the whole issue. So I guess for the finance people, are you looking at this? I know it's hard to be that granular with individual companies, but is this interesting? For Daniela, are you confident that the company you work for is in the right place on those three? It's a sincere question. I wonder. Yeah. For UN Global Compact, are you pushing your companies on this? With 18,000 members, you probably had a low bar because you want as many companies in. But at some point, you're going to have to start also being rougher. Yeah. That's basically it. I think it impacts us also. Looking forward to the responses.
Thank you, Per. Can we, Charlie, do you want to?
Move to Fernando.
Or you just pass it on.
Thanks for the questions. Yeah, well, for companies to join the Global Compact, we have our principles, and that's sort of the baseline, the bare minimum. And so we are continuously looking at ways to mobilize them to do more. Sort of being a participant company should not be just, we sign off, or each company signs off, has minimum requirement of issuing a communication on progress on what they've been doing to align on the 10 principles that we have. And as I was mentioning, we have this CFO coalition where we're beginning to do that, to see, like, are they putting the money towards what they said they are doing? And so we aim to push them further, but also listening to the companies as to what challenges are they facing. And we've heard from some companies, that they face certain restrictions in some countries, and sort of we aim also to foster policy dialogues among the between companies and policymakers to identify exactly what's preventing a company in a specific country or area or region, city, that prevents them from investing in the Scope 3 or in renewables. We've heard from some companies, for instance, in Japan, they say, well, the renewables, it's just way too expensive, or they're not enough. So, or I look at my supply chains, and in certain countries, they cannot have investments in solar because they are forced to get the energy from a state-owned utility, or that there's just not available. So we want to make sure that there's that connection, so that the regulations and the policies, the laws are there to foster the investment, and then at the same time push the companies to make those investments that are necessary. So I think we sort of want to make sure addressing climate change is not like a coin that looking at two sides of the same coin, and companies and policymakers, but it's really like a Rubik's Cube. There's so many issues at play, issues around nature, biodiversity, climate, energy. So we aim at pushing them and pushing companies further, starting with the biggest ones that have more resources to do so.
On your three questions, I'll be quick. On lobbying, we ask questions and we take action on that. CapEx also very important. Scope 3. For oil and gas companies, for car producers, where there's a direct link to fossil fuels, it's very important. But we need, and I mentioned, we need to be ambitious but realistic. We had a shareholder proposal this year for a dollar store in Canada. And the proposal asked, it was put by an NGO, they asked that the company produce Scope 3 targets on everything by 2030. We voted against because this is unrealistic. To expect a retailer to be able to calculate the carbon footprint of the Christmas lights and the Halloween decorations and all the stuff that they sell by 2030 is just ridiculous. Today, the world is not there. What we said to both the company and NGO is, how about having asked them to set a Scope 3 target on their last mile transportation? Because that's doable. They could electrify the fleet that goes from the warehouses to the store. And so it needs to be ambitious, but it needs to be graduated. Otherwise, and the reason we voted against is we said to the NGO, we own 12% of that company. They're going to stop talking to us if we ask them to do things that are completely unrealistic. And so we need to engage with them. We need to have a dialogue. We need to push them, but not over the edge. Sorry, I have to go. I'm expected somewhere else, so I'll just run out.
Thank you very much. See you. Good luck.
So first off, I would say I think you're asking exactly the right questions. These are three of the harder litmus tests that I would look at when I look at these things. So maybe taking a couple of them really quickly, one by one. So on capital expenditure, CapEx, I think this is essential. You could almost have the other two elements and not have CapEx. And I would argue that if you want to know how serious a company is about their sustainability efforts, point me to where they're investing, and specifically where they're investing in their business. For me, this area is really critical. I felt that we were starting to turn the corner when we had the hard CapEx conversations. And there are a couple of areas, a couple of parts that are just a part of my portfolio where we said, okay, for us to do anything on this part of the transition, it's going to take a minimum of 100 million. And we just said that up front. And that's a big number. And that's one of the CapEx qualifiers that we're actually tracking against. So I think that's absolutely important. On the second part around lobbying, I also think this is critical. And it's interesting, we had a really healthy conversation with our External Sustainability Council about this, because alignment of what you commit to and what you lobby for is, I think, essential. And then the third point on Scope 3, I think Scope 3 is a really long, hard journey. But that starts with how are you, for us, like how are we working with our suppliers? And there's an extensive amount of work that we're doing, but it's still a really long, hard journey. But all of that is to say, I think those three questions and those three areas are critical. I think they're the right ones.
So as an investor that engages companies on this, especially our highest relative bidders, as part of our governance of sustainability, we ask for board level oversight. We ask for link, not just to performance, but to executive compensation. And then how in reality that is, not just yes it is, but like the details behind it. And I think the CapEx questions is also extremely important. I want to, so yes on all three, and we get varying responses on all three, to be honest. And so we're really pushing for transparency. And we really want to understand the accountability chain from the top down, bottom up. How do you embed that? How do you regionalize it? Lobbying, so essential. I've spent a decade engaging companies on lobbying alignment here in the US in particular, but also globally. And we started with just disclose, be transparent about where the money is going. How are you engaging in public policies? Then it advanced to public policy, like what are your stated public policies and how are you aligning that with what you're doing directly, what you're doing indirectly through trade associations. So then we moved to ask for disclosure on what is your process for assessing alignment, especially with indirects. And the third one is actually asking them to adopt a climate-aligned, a Paris-aligned climate lobbying policy and process, and be transparent on it. That's like the most advanced. And I think especially for the highest emitters, that's super critical. One last thing, Scope 3. Yes, you can't do it all. So pick proportionality. Where is your most material exposure? Start with your top, suppliers, and start to get real data, right? Start asking them to assess and disclose their GHG data. It's a journey, but let's start with the highest Scope 3 exposures. Very doable, I think.
Okay. Thank you. So looking at the time, we only have a couple of minutes left. I just want to check if there's any comments from the audience, maybe a quick question. No? Okay. Well, I'd firstly really like to thank the panelists, as well as our keynote address by Per today, for such a fantastic session. It was really informative, and I hope that the audience also felt the same. I think we really found inspiration and some confidence from today's speakers who are taking the steps needed in that collective effort. And you may be acting independently from one another, but yet collectively reinforcing each other's actions so that we can strengthen corporate progress on the Paris Agreement. So thank you very much.